My grandfather's dying words were a whisper, a dry rustle of sound that seemed to catch on the tubes and wires surrounding him. "The money," he'd rasped, his eyes finding mine across the dim hospital room. "It's buried in the garden." He squeezed my hand, a faint pressure that was the last of his strength. Then he was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the quiet, rhythmic beep of a machine that no longer had a purpose. My mother, Helen, let out a sob, her shoulders shaking as my father wrapped an arm around her. My Uncle Robert stood on the other side of the bed, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, his eyes flickered, a strange light entering them. It wasn't grief. It was something else entirely. Something sharp and calculating. My Aunt Carol, his wife, moved to his side, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. She murmured something I couldn't hear, but I saw the nod he gave her. The transaction was complete. My grandfather, Arthur, had been dead for less than a minute, and they were already thinking about the money. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was a feeling I was used to when it came to my uncle. My grandfather had been a simple man. He ran a small hardware store his whole life, worked with his hands, and saved his pennies. He never trusted banks, a sentiment he'd repeat every time a holiday came around and he'd slip me a crisp $50 bill. "Keep it somewhere safe," he would say. "Not in a place where men in suits can lose it for you." So the idea of him burying his life savings wasn't that far-fetched. The garden at his house was his pride and joy, a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of flowers, vegetables, and winding stone paths. It was also huge, covering nearly half an acre behind his small, tidy house. If he'd buried something out there, finding it would be a serious task. The days after the funeral were a blur of casseroles and condolences. Robert, however, was a man with a singular focus. He barely spoke of my grandfather. Instead, he talked about honoring his last wishes. "We need to find it," he said 2 days after we'd put my grandfather in the ground. We were all gathered in my grandfather's living room, the air thick with the scent of old books and lemon polish. It's what he wanted. He wanted the family to have it. "Robert, it's too soon," my mother said, her voice thin. "Can we not just grieve for a moment?" "Grieving doesn't pay the bills." "Helen," Robert said dismissively. He always spoke to my mother like she was a child. Dad knew that. He was a practical man. He wouldn't want us sitting around moping while his legacy rots in the ground. Aunt Carol nodded in agreement. "Robert's right, Helen. Think of it as a final gift from your father. A way to take care of everyone." She smiled, a tight, practiced expression that never reached her eyes. She looked at me. "Sarah, you were his favorite. You know he'd want us to follow his instructions." I didn't say anything. They were using my relationship with him against me, and it made my skin crawl. My grandfather had doted on me, it was true. He taught me how to fix a leaky faucet, how to identify birds by their song, and how to tell a good story. He never once spoke to me about money, other than his warnings about banks. His legacy to me was the scent of sawdust and the warmth of his hand in mine. It wasn't a hole in the ground. But Robert was relentless. He was my grandfather's only son, and he acted as if that made him the sole heir to everything, including my grandfather's final, cryptic command. He and Carol had always lived a little beyond their means, their son Mark always needing a new car or a down payment for some failed business venture. They saw my grandfather as a walking, talking bank account, and they were constantly disappointed by his frugality. Now, in death, he had finally offered them the jackpot they'd always craved. The thought of them getting their hands on his hard-earned money filled me with a quiet rage. "When do we start?" my cousin Mark asked from the armchair where he was slouched, scrolling on his phone. He was the very picture of his father's entitlement, but with an added layer of pure laziness. "Saturday," Robert declared, as if he were a general planning an invasion. "We'll all meet here at 9 in the morning. Bring shovels." I looked at my dad, David. He gave a slight shake of his head, a silent message of support. He knew this was wrong, But he also knew that arguing with Robert was like arguing with a hurricane. You just had to board up the windows and wait for it to pass. That Saturday, the air was cool and bright. I arrived at my grandfather's house to find Robert already in the garden, a brand new spade in his hand. He was wearing work boots that looked like they'd never seen a speck of dirt. Mark was leaning against a tree, looking bored, and Carol was setting up a lawn chair on the patio, a large glass of iced tea already in her hand. "Glad you could make it," Robert said, not looking at me. "We need to be strategic about this. The old oak tree is a good landmark. Let's start there and work our way out in a grid pattern." My mom arrived a few minutes later, her face pale. She was holding a small trowel, looking lost. "I feel like we're desecrating his garden," she whispered to me. "We are," I whispered back. "But it's easier to go along with it for now." I grabbed a shovel from the shed. It was my grandfather's, the handle worn smooth from his hands. Holding it felt both comforting and deeply sad. I took a deep breath and plunged it into the soft earth near a bed of rose bushes he had babied for 50 years. The dirt smelled rich and alive. Tearing it up felt like a violation. We dug for hours. Robert barked orders, Mark complained about blisters, and Carol offered unhelpful advice from the patio. "Try a little more to the left, dear," she'd call out. "It feels luckier over there." My mom and I worked in silence, our movements slow and respectful. We carefully lifted sections of turf and set them aside, trying to do as little damage as possible. My dad, who had come with us, worked alongside us, his quiet presence a buffer against Robert's abrasive energy. By midday, the garden was a mess of upturned soil and discarded clumps of grass. We had found nothing but rocks and earthworms. Robert was getting frustrated, his face red with exertion and annoyance. "He must have buried it deep," he grumbled, wiping sweat from his forehead. The old man was stronger than he looked. "Maybe we should stop," my mom suggested timidly. "We can come back another day." "No," Robert snapped. "We're not stopping until we find it." He pointed his shovel at a patch of ground near an old, crumbling bird bath. "There. Nobody's checked there yet. Sarah, you dig there." I didn't want to. That spot felt different, quieter. It was shaded by a large lilac bush, and my grandfather had always kept a small bench there. It was his thinking spot. But I was tired of fighting. I moved over and pushed the shovel into the ground. It struck something on the first try. It wasn't the dull thud of hitting a rock. It was a hollow, scraping sound. "I've got something," I said. Instantly, everyone stopped. Robert rushed over, his eyes gleaming. "That's it. I knew it. Get out of the way." He pushed me aside and began digging frantically, scooping out handfuls of dirt with his hands. Mark even put his phone down and came closer to watch. My mom and dad stood back, their faces etched with worry. A dirty, brown texture began to emerge from the soil. It looked like old, rotting fabric. Burlap. "It's a sack," Robert breathed, his voice thick with excitement. He clawed at the dirt around it, finally getting enough leverage to pull. With a great heave, he dragged a large, lumpy bundle out of the hole. It was heavy and misshapen. "This is it," he said, almost laughing. "The crazy old man actually did it." He fumbled with the twine holding the burlap together. It was rotten and broke easily in his hands. He tore the fabric away, his movements greedy and impatient. He was expecting to see stacks of cash, neat bundles of $100 bills. But that's not what he saw. What he saw was a bone. It was long and yellowed with age, a human femur. As he pulled more of the burlap away, the rest of the shape became clear. A rib cage, a spine. And at the top, nestled in the dirt-caked fabric, was a skull, its empty eye socket staring up at the bright, sunny sky. A collective gasp went through our small group. My mother cried out and stumbled backward, my dad catching her. Mark made a gagging sound and turned away. Carol on the patio dropped her glass of iced tea with a smash. Robert just stared. He looked from the skeleton to the hole, then back to the skeleton. The elation drained from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "This isn't money. What kind of sick joke is this?" He looked at me, at my mom, as if we were somehow responsible, as if we had conspired with my dead grandfather to play this horrific prank on him. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the remains of a person who had been lying hidden in my grandfather's garden for who knows how long. The cold knot in my stomach tightened until I could barely breathe. My grandfather's last words echoed in my head. "The money is buried in the garden." He hadn't been talking about cash. He had been trying to tell us something else, something terrible. And we had just dug it up. I am Sarah, 28 years old, and my world had just tilted on its axis. I looked at the bones, then at my family, a tableau of greed, horror, and confusion. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that nothing would ever be the same again. My grandfather had left us a mystery, not a treasure. And I had a terrible feeling that solving it would tear our family apart. The silence was finally broken by Robert. His voice was low and venomous. "Put it back." "What?" I asked, my own voice a croak. "I said put it back," he repeated, gesturing wildly at the skeleton. "Cover it up. We never saw this. This never happened." "Are you insane?" my dad exclaimed, stepping forward. "Robert, that's a person. We can't just rebury a person." "Watch me," Robert snarled. "This will ruin everything. The police will be crawling all over this place. It'll be a crime scene. We'll never be able to sell the house. The value will plummet. Think about it. This is a financial disaster." He was looking at a human being's remains, and his first and only thought was about property values. I felt a surge of revulsion so strong it almost made me sick. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension. "We are not covering this up." Robert turned his glare on me. "Who do you think you are? This is my father's house. I make the decisions here." He left his last words to me. I shot back, surprised by my own fire. He wanted this found, and I am not going to let you disrespect him or whoever this is by throwing them back in a hole like a piece of trash. "She's right, Robert," my mom said, finding her voice. She was still pale, but her eyes were resolute. "We have to call the police." "You're all fools," Robert shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "You have no idea the trouble you're causing. This is family business. We handle it ourselves." "Killing someone and burying them in the garden isn't family business, it's a felony," my dad said calmly. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling them." Robert looked like he was about to physically stop him. He took a step forward, his fists clenched. Carol, finally snapping out of her shock, rushed down from the patio. "Robert, don't," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "He's right. They'll find out eventually. It will look worse if we try to hide it." Her voice was pragmatic, her mind already calculating the new angles, the best way to spin this disaster. Robert deflated, the fight going out of him. He kicked at a clod of dirt, his face a storm of fury and frustration. He looked at the bones with pure hatred, as if they had personally wronged him. My dad made the call. The next few hours were surreal. The garden, my grandfather's peaceful sanctuary, was suddenly swarming with uniformed officers and detectives. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape, turning our family drama into an official crime scene. We were separated and questioned one by one. I sat at the kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm tea untouched in front of me. A kind-faced detective named Miller asked me to go over it all again. "So your grandfather's last words were exactly what?" he asked. "The money is buried in the garden," I recited, the words feeling more ominous each time I said them. "And your uncle was very keen to find this money?" "He was obsessed," I said. "He organized the whole dig. He was sure it was my grandfather's life savings." Detective Miller made a note. "And what was his reaction when you found the remains?" "He was angry," I said. He said it was a sick joke. He wanted to rebury them. He said that? Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. Yes. He was worried about the property value. The detective's expression didn't change, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. He knew what kind of man my uncle was. When it was Robert's turn, I could hear his booming voice from the living room. He was putting on a performance. I strained to listen. No, it wasn't about money, he was saying, his tone dripping with false sincerity. It was about closure. My father was a bit eccentric in his final days. We were worried he'd buried something of sentimental value. Family heirlooms, perhaps. We were just trying to put his mind at ease in a way. I felt my blood run cold. He was lying. He was already crafting a new narrative, one where he was the dutiful son, not a greedy vulture. And when you found the body? The other detective asked. We were horrified, of course, Robert said smoothly. Absolutely shocked. My first thought was for my poor mother and my niece. Such a traumatic discovery for them. I had to clench my fists to keep from marching in there and calling him a liar to his face. He was twisting the story, painting himself as a hero while making the rest of us sound like hysterical women. After the police finished their initial statements, they told us the house was now an active investigation site. We couldn't touch anything. Robert protested loudly, complaining about the delay in settling the estate, but the detectives were firm. We all left in a state of shock. My mom and dad took me back to their place. My mom was distraught. Who could it be? She kept asking, wringing her hands. Your father never hurt a soul in his life. He wouldn't have. Of course he wouldn't have, Helen, my dad said, putting an arm around her. There's another explanation for this. But what was it? My grandfather was the most gentle man I'd ever known. The thought of him being involved in something like this was impossible. And yet, the bones were in his garden. He had led us to them. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept seeing the empty sockets of the skull staring up at me. I thought about my grandfather's last moments. He hadn't seemed scared or guilty. He'd seemed determined, like he was passing on a burden. The next day, I couldn't stand sitting around and waiting. Against my parents' advice, I drove back to my grandfather's house. The yellow tape was still up, a stark barrier against the familiar landscape of my childhood. A single police car was parked out front. I knew I couldn't go inside the house, but I needed to be there. I decided to talk to the neighbors. Maybe they had seen something, years ago. I started with Mrs. Gable from across the street. She was ancient and had lived there longer than my grandfather. Oh, Arthur was a lovely man, she said, peering at me through thick glasses. Kept to himself mostly, always working in that garden of his, a real green thumb. Did you ever see anything unusual? I asked. Anyone visiting him that seemed out of place? She thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. Well, there was a lot of commotion once, a long, long time ago. Must have been, 30 years or more. A big family argument. Shouting in the yard. It was late at night. An argument? My heart started beating faster. Do you remember who was there? I saw Arthur, of course, she said, and his boy, Robert. He was a young man then, full of fire. And there was another young fellow. I didn't know him. Dark hair. They were all yelling. Then it got quiet. Never saw the dark-haired boy again. My blood turned to ice. A fight. With Robert, my grandfather, and an unknown young man who was never seen again. Do you remember anything else? I pressed. No, dearie, she said, shaking her head. My husband told me to mind my own business. People's family troubles are their own. I thanked her and walked away, my mind reeling. Robert was there. He was part of it. And he had lied to the police, pretending he knew nothing. He hadn't just been trying to cover up the existence of a body to protect property values. He was trying to cover up his own involvement. I needed to find out who that dark-haired boy was. I went to my mom. I found her in her kitchen, staring into space. I didn't want to upset her more, but I had to ask. "Mom," I said gently, "did our family know anyone who just disappeared? A long time ago?" She looked at me, her eyes clouded with memory. "Disappeared? Well, there was Leo." "Leo?" "Your grandfather's nephew. My cousin," she said. "He was a bit of a black sheep. Always in some kind of trouble. He had a huge fight with Grandpa Arthur about some money he claimed he was owed from my grandmother's will. He said he was going to run away, start a new life. And he did. We never heard from him again." "What did he look like?" I asked, my breath catching in my throat. "Oh, he was handsome in a brooding sort of way," she recalled. "Thick, dark hair." Dark hair. The boy Mrs. Gable saw. "When was this, Mom?" "It must have been about 35 years ago," she said. "Why are you asking all this, Sarah?" "No reason," I lied, my mind racing. Just thinking about old family stories. But it wasn't just a story. The police had said the bones were old, maybe 30 or 40 years. It all fit. The body in the garden wasn't a stranger. It was my cousin Leo. And my Uncle Robert had been there the night he disappeared. I felt a new kind of dread. Darker and more personal. This wasn't just about a secret my grandfather had kept. This was about a crime my uncle had witnessed, or worse, been a part of. And he would do anything to keep it buried. The police investigation crawled along at a snail's pace. They confirmed the bones belonged to a male, likely in his early 20s, and that he had been dead for approximately 3 to 4 decades. It was Leo. I was sure of it. They were working on a DNA confirmation using a sample from my mother. In the meantime, the family was fracturing. Robert called me every other day, his voice a furious whisper. "Are you happy now?" He'd hiss into the phone. "The whole neighborhood is talking. The house is worthless. The estate is frozen. This is all your fault." "My fault?" I'd reply, my voice shaking with anger. "You're the one who wanted to dig up the garden for money you weren't even entitled to." "He was my father. I was entitled to everything. He was my grandfather, and he was a good man who you bullied his entire life." The calls always ended with him slamming the phone down. Each conversation left me feeling drained and furious. He wasn't scared of the police. He was angry about the money, or so he wanted me to believe. His rage felt like a performance, a smokescreen to hide a deeper fear. I decided to do my own digging, not in the garden, but in the past. My grandfather's house was still off limits, but I remembered a trunk of old family documents he had given my mother for safekeeping years ago. It was sitting in her attic. "Mom, can I look through Grandpa's old papers?" I asked her one afternoon. "Of course, honey," she said. "I don't know what you're hoping to find." I was hoping to find a loose thread, anything that could help me understand what happened that night. I spent a whole day in the dusty attic, sneezing and sifting through brittle letters, old tax returns, and photo albums with curling black and white pictures. Deep at the bottom of the trunk, I found it. It was a small leather-bound ledger. My grandfather's handwriting, neat and precise, filled the pages. It was a record of his personal expenses, going back decades. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding. Most of it was mundane. Property taxes, donations to his church, a new water heater. But then I got to the section dated about 35 years ago, right around the time Leo disappeared. A new entry appeared, one that repeated every single month. See, $200. It continued for years. The amount would occasionally increase, adjusted for what I assumed was inflation. $200 every month paid to someone with the initial C. It felt significant. Who was C? And why was my frugal grandfather making these regular, undocumented cash payments? I thought back to the story of Leo. The fight was about money. What if my grandfather had felt guilty? What if he was secretly sending money to someone Leo had left behind? A girlfriend? A child? The payments continued for decades, a silent, steady drain on his savings. They only stopped a few months before he died, when he became too ill to manage his own affairs. I brought the ledger to my friend Jess. She was a paralegal, and her mind worked in logical, methodical ways that mine didn't. I laid it all out for her. The bones, the story of Leo, Robert's suspicious behavior, and now, the ledger. "This is more than a family secret, Sarah," she said, her eyes wide. "This C could be anyone. But the fact that the payment started right after Leo vanished is not a coincidence." "I know," I said. "But how do I find out who C is?" "You need to think about who was in their lives back then," she suggested. "Think about Robert and Carol." Aunt Carol. Her name started with a C. But why would my grandfather be sending her money? She had married Robert. She was family. It didn't make sense. Unless... A strange, unsettling thought began to form in my mind. Carol had always been cold and distant with me and my mother. She and Robert were a unit, a fortress of two against the rest of the family. She was always perfectly put together, her home immaculate, her social life a whirl of charity luncheons and garden club meetings. Her public image was everything to her. What if her past wasn't as perfect as she pretended? I needed to talk to someone who remembered that time clearly, someone outside the immediate blast zone of my family's drama. My great-aunt Eleanor came to mind. She was my grandfather's older sister. She was in her 90s now, living in a retirement community an hour away. But her mind was still sharp as a tack when it came to ancient family gossip. I drove to see her the next day, bringing a box of her favorite pastries. "Sarah, what a surprise," she said, her face lighting up as she welcomed me into her small, chintz-filled apartment. We made small talk for a while, but I was too anxious to be patient. I finally broached the subject. "Aunt Eleanor," I began carefully, "I've been thinking about Cousin Leo." Her expression changed. The cheerful smile faded. "Oh, that boy," she said, shaking her head. "Such a tragedy." "Everyone says he just ran off," I said, watching her face. "That was the story," she said, her voice dropping. "Easier than the truth." "What was the truth?" I asked. She sighed, a long, weary sound. "Leo was wild, but he wasn't a bad boy. He was in love, desperately in love, with a girl the family didn't approve of. They thought she was beneath him." "Who was she?" I asked, leaning forward. Eleanor looked at me, her old eyes seeming to see right through me. "It was Carol." The name hit me like a physical blow. "Aunt Carol? Robert's wife?" "She wasn't his wife then," Eleanor said. "She was just a girl from the next town over. Pretty as a picture, but her family had no money. Leo was crazy about her. He was going to defy everyone, take the money he thought he was owed, and run away with her. He told me so himself." My head was spinning. Carol and Leo. They were together. "What happened?" I whispered. "He went to confront your grandfather for the money," Eleanor said. "And that was the last anyone saw of him. A few months later, we got an invitation. Carol was marrying Robert. It was all very sudden. We all thought it was strange, but nobody dared to ask questions. Robert was always so... intense. Intense. That was one word for it. The pieces were starting to slot together, forming a picture that was uglier than I could have ever imagined. Leo and Carol were in love. Leo went to get money to run away with her. He gets into a fight with my grandfather and Robert. He disappears. A few months later, Carol marries Robert, and right after that, my grandfather starts making secret monthly payments to C. It couldn't be a coincidence. I needed to talk to Robert. I had to see his face when I brought this up. I called him. "What do you want now?" he answered, his voice already hostile. "I need to talk to you," I said. "In person." "I have nothing to say to you." "I think you do," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been looking into things. I know about Leo." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. "That's ancient history," he finally said, but his voice had lost its bluster. It was tight, strained. I also know about the ledger. I pushed. Grandpa was sending money to someone every month. Someone with the initial C for 35 years. Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing. "You need to stop this, Sarah," he said, his voice a low warning. "You are digging up trouble you can't even begin to understand. Drop it. For your own good. Let the dead rest." "Leo isn't resting," I said quietly. "He's in a box at the medical examiner's office, and I'm not going to stop until I know why." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. His reaction was all the confirmation I needed. He was terrified. He and Carol were hiding something monstrous. The money in the garden wasn't just about a body. It was about a secret that had been festering at the heart of our family for my entire life. And my grandfather, with his dying breath, had given me the map to uncover it all. I felt a grim resolve settle over me. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated my love for my grandfather. That was a mistake they were going to regret. The threat from Robert didn't scare me. It galvanized me. He wasn't just trying to protect his inheritance anymore. He was trying to protect a secret so dark it had remained buried for over 3 decades. My grandfather didn't kill Leo. I knew that in my bones. But he had covered it up. The monthly payments to C weren't blackmail money paid to a stranger. They were penance. And Carol was at the center of it. I couldn't shake the image of a young Carol, in love with the family black sheep, suddenly marrying the intense older brother, Robert. Why? The speed of it was what bothered Great Aunt Eleanor. It bothered me too. Was it a rebound? Was she scared? Or was there another reason for such a sudden, life-altering decision? The police had sealed the house, but the shed was outside the yellow tape. I remembered my grandfather kept dozens of boxes of old junk out there, things he couldn't bear to throw away. It was a long shot, but I had to look. I went back to the house at dusk, the evening light casting long shadows across the desecrated garden. The shed was unlocked, as always. It smelled of rust, oil, and dry potting soil. It was cluttered and chaotic, a perfect reflection of my grandfather's mind, full of useful things and forgotten treasures. I spent hours pulling down boxes, my hands getting covered in grime and cobwebs. I found old tools, stacks of gardening magazines from the 1980s, and a box of my own childhood drawings. It was a painful, nostalgic journey. Finally, in a dark corner behind a broken lawnmower, I saw it. A small metal tin, rusted at the edges. It was an old biscuit tin, the painted image of a smiling woman in a bonnet almost completely faded. It was locked with a tiny, flimsy padlock. My breath caught. I'd seen a key like that before. I raced home, my heart hammering against my ribs. I went straight to my bedroom, to the jewelry box on my dresser. It was a gift from my grandfather on my 10th birthday. I rummaged past old necklaces and earrings until my fingers closed around it. A tiny, ornate brass key on a faded ribbon. "This is for a treasure box," he had told me, his eyes twinkling. "A very special one. You keep it safe for me." I had thought it was just a whimsical present, a part of the games we used to play, but it wasn't a game. I drove back to the shed, the little key clutched in my sweaty palm. I knelt in the dirt and dust, my hands shaking as I fitted the key into the lock on the rusted tin. It resisted for a moment, then turned with a small, satisfying click. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was a stack of letters, tied with the same kind of faded ribbon that was on the key. They were written on thin blue airmail paper. The handwriting was a looping, passionate scrawl. I unfolded the first one. "My dearest Carol," it began. My blood ran cold. I sat there on the floor of the dusty shed and I read them all. They were from Leo. Love letters, full of whispered promises and desperate plans. He wrote about their secret meetings, the way she smiled, the future they were going to have together, far away from their disapproving families. Then I got to the last one. The paper was slightly crumpled, the ink a little smudged, as if written in a great hurry. "Carol, it said. "I'm doing it tonight. I'm going to your Uncle Arthur's. He owes me that money, and I'm not leaving without it. It's enough to get us started. Pack a bag. I'll come for you as soon as I have it. By morning, we'll be free. Forever yours, Leo." There was one more thing in the box. Tucked beneath the letters was a small, folded piece of paper. A doctor's note. It was a confirmation of pregnancy. The patient's name was Carol. The date was just 3 days before Leo wrote his final letter. Everything crashed into place with the force of a physical impact. Carol was pregnant with Leo's child. They weren't just running away. They were starting a family. Leo went to get the money for them, and he never came back. And a few months later, a pregnant Carol married Robert, my cousin Mark. I did the math in my head, my hands shaking so badly I could barely think. Mark's birthday. It was 8 months after Leo disappeared. Everyone had always whispered about how he'd been a honeymoon baby, how quickly Carol had gotten pregnant after the wedding. It was all a lie. A monstrous 35-year-long lie. Mark wasn't Robert's son. He was Leo's son. My grandfather hadn't been paying blackmail. He'd been supporting his nephew's child. He was sending money to Carol, his niece by marriage, to help her raise the son of the man who died in his garden. He had done it in secret to protect her, to protect Mark, and most of all, to protect his own son, Robert, from a truth he could never handle. Robert had spent his entire life being proud of his son, his heir. His whole identity was wrapped up in being a father, a provider for his perfect family. But his family was a sham. His son wasn't his, and his wife had been in love with another man, a man he was there to see on the night he died. This was the leverage. This was the truth that could bring their entire world crashing down. The letters weren't just a story. They were proof. The pregnancy confirmation was the bomb that would detonate it all. I sat there in the dark shed for a long time, the letters in my lap. I felt a profound sadness for my grandfather, who had carried this terrible secret alone for so many years. He had lived a life of quiet atonement, paying for a sin that I was now certain was not his. He had paid to protect his son. What had Robert done that night? Mrs. Gable saw him there. He was young and full of fire. Leo was there to get money. An argument, a disappearance, a secret burial. My grandfather wasn't strong enough to kill a man and dig a grave even 35 years ago. He had a bad back his whole life. But Robert? A strong, hot-headed young man, furious at this troublemaker who was fighting with his father? The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, and the image it created was horrifying. My grandfather hadn't killed Leo. He had only buried him. He was covering for Robert. My grief for my grandfather transformed into a cold, hard fury. Robert and Carol had lived a comfortable life on the foundation of this secret. They had accepted my grandfather's money, all while treating him with contempt and greed. They had looked down on my mother and me. They had acted superior, entitled. And all along they were liars. Carol had lied about her past, her love, and the paternity of her own son. And Robert had lied about everything. My grandfather's last words were not a confession of his own guilt. They were an accusation. He was finally pointing his finger from beyond the grave. The money is buried in the garden. The money was the truth about Leo, the truth about Mark, the truth about Robert. He had given me the key to his treasure box. He had trusted me to find it. Now it was up to me to use it. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. It was the perfect stage. The whole family would be there. The lawyer, my parents, Mark, and of course Robert and Carol. They would walk in expecting to stake their claim on my grandfather's assets. They had no idea I was about to strip them of everything they truly valued: their pride, their reputation, and their carefully constructed lies. I placed the letters and the doctor's note back in the tin box. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was justice. I spent the week preparing. It felt like I was getting ready for a battle. I made copies of the letters and the doctor's note. I gave one set to my friend Jess with strict instructions. If anything happens to me or if I call you, release these to the police and to my parents, I told her. She looked at me with worried eyes but agreed. I also met with my parents. I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't bring myself to drop that bomb on them yet, but I needed them to be ready. At the will reading, Robert is going to be difficult, I said to them over dinner. He's always difficult, my dad said wryly. This will be different, I said. Things are going to come out. I need you to trust me and back me up no matter what happens. My mom looked at me, her brow furrowed with concern. Sarah, what have you found? The truth, I said simply. Grandpa wanted me to find the truth. She searched my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Sarah, we trust you. The day of the will reading arrived. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark dress. I felt strangely calm, the way you do in the eye of a storm. I had the small rusted tin box in my handbag. It felt as heavy as a gravestone. We gathered in a sterile, wood-paneled conference room at the lawyer's office. The air was thick with tension. My parents and I sat on one side of the large mahogany table. Robert, Carol, and Mark sat on the other. Robert was tapping his fingers impatiently on the table, avoiding my gaze. Carol had her concerned matriarch face on, a mask of polite sorrow. Mark looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, his eyes glued to his phone. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat. We are gathered today to read the last will and testament of Arthur Miller. He began to read in a dry monotone. The will was straightforward. My grandfather left some modest bequests to his church and a few charities. He left a collection of old tools to my dad. Then came the major assets. To my beloved son, Robert Miller, the lawyer read, I leave the sum of $50,000. Robert's face tightened. $50,000 was a lot of money, but it was a pittance compared to what he was expecting. He clearly thought the house and the bulk of the savings would be his. To my grandson, Mark Miller, the lawyer continued, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $100,000 to be accessed on his 30th birthday. Mark actually looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Carol gave a small, pleased smile. 100,000 was more like it. Then came the final part. All the rest and residue of my estate, including my house located at 125 Oak Street, and all monies held in my savings and checking accounts, I leave to be shared equally between my beloved daughter, Helen Gable, and my beloved granddaughter, Sarah Gable. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Robert exploded. What? He bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. The sound made everyone jump. That's impossible. He wouldn't do that. Mr. Thompson looked at him over his glasses. The will is perfectly clear, Mr. Miller. It was signed and witnessed 2 months ago. He was senile, Robert shouted, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. He wasn't in his right mind. She? He pointed a trembling finger at my mother. And her? He pointed at me. They manipulated him. They poisoned him against me, his only son. Robert, please, Carol said, putting a hand on his arm, but he shook it off. No, I won't be silent. I was the dutiful one. I was there for him. I did everything for him. He owed me that house. He owed me everything. This was it. The opening I had been waiting for. I took a deep breath. What exactly did you do for him, Robert? I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his rage like a knife. He whirled on me, his eyes blazing. What? I looked after him. I gave him a grandson. I upheld the family name. Did you? I asked, my gaze unwavering. I slowly pulled the rusted tin box from my handbag and placed it on the table between us. Because it seems to me that Grandpa spent the last 35 years of his life doing things for you. Robert stared at the box, his face draining of color. He recognized it. I could see the flicker of terrified recognition in his eyes. Carol's polite mask slipped. Her hand flew to her throat. What is that? She asked, her voice a strained whisper. It's a treasure box, I said, looking directly at her now. Grandpa gave me the key a long time ago. He said it was very special. I finally found out why. I opened the box. I didn't take the letters out yet. I just let them sit there. Grandpa told us to look in the garden. I continued, my voice steady. He said that's where the money was. We found Leo's body. But that wasn't the money he was talking about, was it? The real money. He was sending it to you, wasn't he, Carol? Carol froze. Her face was a deathly white. Robert looked from me to his wife, confusion and panic warring on his face. What is she talking about, Carol? He demanded. He sent you $200 a month every month for 35 years, I said, my voice gaining strength. For Mark. I paused, letting the name hang in the air. Mark finally looked up, a frown on his face. For me? Why? I looked from Carol's terrified face to Robert's furious one. Then I looked at Mark. I almost felt sorry for him. He was just a pawn in a game he never knew he was playing. I took a deep breath and delivered the final, devastating blow. Because Mark isn't Robert's son. The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical explosion. My mother gasped. My father stared, speechless. Mark's jaw dropped. Robert just stared at me, his mind refusing to process what I had said. Then slowly he turned his head and looked at his wife. The look on his face was something I will never forget. It was a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and a dawning, monstrous rage. Carol, he said, his voice a choked whisper. What is she talking about? Carol started to shake her head, a pathetic, jerky motion. She's lying. She's crazy. She's trying to cause trouble. Am I? I asked calmly. I reached into the box and took out the stack of letters. I placed them on the table. Then I took out the small, folded doctor's note. These are love letters, from Leo to you, talking about the baby you were carrying. Their baby, and this, I unfolded the note, is the proof. You were pregnant with Leo's child. The room erupted. No, Robert breathed, shaking his head. No, no, no. He looked at Mark, his son, his pride and joy, and for the first time he saw a stranger. He saw the ghost of Leo. Mark shot to his feet. Is this true? He yelled at Carol, his face pale with shock and fury. Tell me it's true. Carol finally broke. A terrible, ragged sob tore from her throat. I was going to tell you, she cried, looking at Robert. I was scared. He disappeared. I was alone. I didn't know what to do. You lied to me, Robert said. His voice was no longer shouting. It was dead, cold and flat. All the air had been sucked out of him. His rage had collapsed into a black hole of despair. My whole life, you lied to me. He slumped back in his chair, a broken man. His identity, his pride, his entire world had been built on a lie, and I had just demolished it with a handful of old letters. But I wasn't finished. There was one more secret to unearth. One more truth my grandfather wanted found. I looked at Robert, his face buried in his hands. But Leo didn't just disappear, did he, Robert? I said, my voice soft but relentless. He came to the house that night. He argued with Grandpa, and you were there. Mrs. Gable across the street saw you. Robert's head snapped up. His eyes were wide with a new kind of terror. This wasn't about his wife's betrayal anymore. This was about him. Grandpa didn't kill him, I said, the pieces locking into place as I spoke them aloud. He couldn't have. He was a good man, and he had a bad back. He couldn't have fought a young man and then dug a grave. But you could have. You were young and strong, and you had a temper. My mother was crying softly now, my dad holding her hand in a white-knuckled grip. Mark was staring at Robert, his expression a horrified mix of confusion and dawning comprehension. What happened when you went outside, Robert? I pressed. What happened when you saw Leo arguing with your father? You got involved, didn't you? The argument got physical. Robert just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. His face was his confession. The bravado, the anger, the entitlement. It all melted away, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of a scared man who had been hiding for 35 years. "You pushed him," I said, the scene playing out in my mind. "He fell." He hit his head. "On the old stone bird bath." "It was an accident, wasn't it, Robert?" "A stupid, tragic accident." He let out a strangled sob. It was a sound of pure agony, the sound of a dam breaking. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, the words tumbling out of him in a rush. "He was yelling at my dad. He was being disrespectful. I just wanted him to leave. I pushed him. Just a push." He stumbled. "He fell. And he didn't get up. There was so much. So much." He couldn't finish the sentence. The whole room was silent, holding its breath. "And Grandpa," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "He did the only thing he could think of to protect his only son. He helped you bury him. He helped you hide it. And he spent the rest of his life paying for it. He paid for your silence, Robert. He supported the child of the man you killed, all so you could live your life without consequences." The full weight of it all finally landed on him. He wasn't the wronged son. He was the cause of all of it. His father's secret pain, his wife's lifelong lie, his own son's stolen identity. It all came back to him. To one stupid, angry push in the dark. He looked at me, his eyes full of a terrible, dawning understanding. He finally saw that my grandfather's final words weren't about a treasure. They were a judgment. The aftermath was swift and devastating. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, had quietly slipped out of the room and called the police as soon as Robert started confessing. They arrived just as the full, ugly story finished spilling out. They didn't use handcuffs. They didn't need to. Robert went with them willingly, a hollowed-out shell of the man who had walked in an hour earlier. Carol left without a word, her face a blank mask of shock. She didn't even look at Mark. He stood alone in the conference room, a young man suddenly adrift, his past erased and his future a terrifying blank. My parents and I went home. My mother wept for hours. She wept for her father and the burden he had carried. She wept for Leo, the cousin she barely remembered. She even wept for Robert, her brother, whose life was now irrevocably destroyed. My father just held her, his own face grim. In the days that followed, the story unraveled publicly. Robert confessed to everything. The official charge was manslaughter. Given the time that had passed and the accidental nature of the death, his lawyer was hopeful for a lenient sentence, but that hardly mattered. His life as he knew it was over. His reputation, the thing he valued almost as much as money, was in ruins. He was the town pariah, the man who killed his cousin and let his father take the blame in silence. I had to give a full statement to Detective Miller. I walked him through everything, from the dig in the garden to the letters in the tin box. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," he said when I was finished. To carry that for so long, to protect his son while still trying to do right by the boy, by Mark. It's a heavy burden. "He was the best man I ever knew," I said, my voice catching. "They just never saw it." The fallout for the rest of the family was just as profound. Carol became a recluse. Her social circle abandoned her overnight. The story was too scandalous, too messy. She was no longer the perfectly put-together wife of a successful man. She was the woman who had lived a lie for 35 years. She put her house up for sale and planned to move away, to a place where no one knew her name. I received a call from Mark about a week later. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. I don't know who else to call," he started. "How are you doing, Mark?" I asked gently. "I'm not," he said with a humorless laugh. I went to see him. Robert, the man I thought was my dad. He couldn't even look at me. My heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Mark." "He's not my dad," he said, the words still sounding foreign. "My dad is bones in a box. My mom, she won't talk about him. She just cries and says she did what she had to do to survive." He paused. "You knew my grandfather, Arthur. Did he ever talk about him? About Leo?" "No," I said honestly. "He never spoke of him, but he took care of you, Mark. In his own way. That trust fund, that was for you. He wanted to make sure you were okay." There was a long silence. Can you tell me about him sometime? Leo? Anything you know? I want to know who I am." "Of course, Mark," I said. "Whenever you're ready." It was the beginning of a strange, tentative relationship. We were cousins, bound by a tragedy that had defined both our lives before we were even born. My mother and I inherited the house, as the will stated. For a while, we didn't know what to do with it. It felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of all the secrets it had held. "We should sell it," my mom said one day as we stood in the garden, looking at the large patch of bare earth where the police had finished their work. "No," I said, surprising myself. "I don't think we should." I looked around at the rose bushes, the lilac, the old oak tree. This was my grandfather's sanctuary. He had poured his life into this soil. The darkness was a part of its story, but it wasn't the whole story. "Let's fix it," I said. "Let's plant something new here. A memorial. For Leo." My mom looked at me and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "Your grandfather would have liked that." So that's what we did. We didn't tear the garden down. We healed it. We planted a beautiful Japanese maple in the spot where Leo had been buried, its leaves a fiery red. We filled the beds with new flowers. Working in the dirt felt cleansing, like we were helping to restore the peace my grandfather had so desperately tried to maintain. The house became a place of healing, not of horror. Before Robert was sentenced, I went to visit him one last time. He had aged 20 years in a matter of weeks. His hair was grayer, his face was lined with a permanent, weary grief. He sat across from me behind a thick pane of glass and looked at me with hollow eyes. "Why?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Why couldn't you just let it go? We could have been rich." The question was so perfectly Robert, so completely focused on the one thing that had driven him his entire life. He still didn't fully get it. I looked at him, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of pity. "Grandfather told me where the money was," I said quietly. "He wanted us to find the truth. You were just looking for cash." He stared at me, and for the first time, a flicker of true understanding seemed to pass through his eyes. He finally understood that the treasure he had been so desperate to find wasn't something you could spend. He had spent his entire life searching for wealth, so consumed by what he thought he was owed that he never saw the real cost. In the end, his frantic digging didn't unearth a fortune. It just uncovered the truth of everything he had already lost.